Okay, I'm going to admit it. I was kind of a fan.
You were?
I was kind of a crush.
Kind of.
I actually watched The Partridge Family. I was obsessed with the Brady Bunch, The Partridge Family, and Happy Days. That's how old I am. And yes, there was a time in my life when I watched TV, and this idol of the 1970s, teen idol star of the Partridge Family, has died. David Cassidy's death came after a close family friend said over the weekend that he had been hospitalized for organ failure and was in need of a liver transplant. Cassidy rose to stardom after he was cast to play Keith Partridge in the 1970s sitcom The Partridge Family. For 4 seasons, the show built a legion of fans with hit songs like I Think I Love You. Cassidy announced earlier this year that he was suffering from dementia. According to his published, he died surrounded by loved ones. David Cassidy was only 67 years old.
So John Heilman,
did you watch?
Yeah, of course I did. John Heilman, a lot of people, you know, it's kind of like the Monkees. It never got any respect back in the 1960s because they were a prefab group put together for TV. Same thing here. What a lot of people don't realize is David Cassidy was a massive recording star and live act, filling up the Houston Astrodome at a time nobody else did it.
Huge, I mean, massively successful, you know, as you say, no love from the critics, but people loved him. And I will say, and I'm sure this is true in your high school and in your high school too, the number of guys, of young boys.
I went to a girls' school.
Okay, well, then at the local boys' school near your girls' school, the number of guys in puka shell necklaces, just because of David Cassidy's puka shells.
Gross.
The puka shell necklace was something that David Cassidy, along with these songs, brought to the culture. And, you know, they were, the Brady Bunch of the Partridge Family, they were massive.
I like
My brother loved puka shell.
The puka shells were massive.
David Cassidy. And do you guys remember Andy Gibb?
Of course.
Shadow dancing.
That's a slightly later era. Slightly later era.
Only slightly.
Different
I'm
family.
50. Okay, good morning, everyone. It's Wednesday, November 22nd. With us, as you can see, we have Heilman. But also joining us this morning, we have Republican strategist and political commentator Susan Del Percio. Just back from Puerto Rico with some stories to tell. My God, some work you've been doing there. Thank you. And NBC News, Capitol Hill correspondent and host of KCDC.
She's got
Come on, guys.
KCDC, Laser Rock.
Oh, yeah.
I bet she has
MSNBC.
I bet she has a puka shell necklace.
Oh,
She does
wow.
also. She's going to obviously have to have a tribute on, obviously, AC/DC,
A look back.
the band,
Behind
got
the
their
music.
name and
Young.
inspiration from KCDC, but this week, another huge loss in the music field.
Yes, another one of the members of that great band.
Wow.
Malcolm
All
Young.
right. Well, a lot to get to this morning. Good to have you all on board. President Donald Trump yesterday broke his silence on Roy Moore and Alabama's Senate race. Trump took questions from reporters as he was departing the White House to board Marine One.
I can tell you one thing for sure. We don't need a liberal person in there, a Democrat. Jones, I've looked at his record. It's terrible in crime. It's terrible in the border. It's terrible in the military. I can tell you for a fact, we do not need somebody that's going to be bad on crime, bad on borders, bad with the military, bad for the Second Amendment.
Mr. President, is an accused child molester better than a Democrat? Is an accused
Well, he
child
denies it.
molester better
Look,
than
he
a
denies it. I mean, if you look at what is really going on and you look at all the things that have happened over the last 48 hours, he totally denies it. He says it didn't happen. And, you know, you have to listen to him also. You're talking about, he said 40 years ago this did not happen. So, you know. I'll be letting you know next week. But I can tell you, you don't need somebody who's soft on crime like Jones.
So do you not believe the accusers? What is your message to women, sir, during this pivotal moment in our country where we're talking about sexual misconduct? You've had your own allegations against you. What do you say to women?
Let me just tell you, Roy Moore denies it. That's all I can say. He denies it. And by the way, he totally denies it.
So, Casey, obviously the President of the United States did do what the White House and Kellyanne Conway sort of tipped their hat to earlier, saying we need a conservative in there that's going to vote along with the President's agenda. You have the President of the United States yesterday saying we don't need a liberal. I mean, this is an endorsement, a de facto endorsement of Roy Moore. And again, once again, the president finds himself on the opposite side of most Republicans in the Senate on Capitol Hill. What's it mean?
Mitch McConnell is not saying right now that he needs Roy Moore's vote in the United States Senate. He is saying the opposite in some ways. I think Mitch McConnell thinks Roy Moore, for a variety of other reasons unrelated to what we've been talking about the last few weeks, would not be a great member of the Republican conference. I think, you know, the president, and I talked to people who are familiar with his thinking in the wake of Roy Moore winning this runoff election. He felt burned when Mitch McConnell and other Republican leaders sent him down to campaign for Luther Strange. It was something that took him a little while to get over, and now he's watching this unfold. He still talks to Steve Bannon, who, of course, is standing by Moore. And look at the kind of campaign that Moore is now running. He is denying everything. He is trying to undermine the credibility of his accusers. He's saying that they are lying. And, you know, there's another person who was accused of sexual misconduct by multiple people very recently who ran a similar kind of campaign and said repeatedly that the women who brought the accusations were liars. And he now, he won his election.
So, Susan, the White House is trying to walk a line that can't be walked. We heard it first from Kellyanne Conway, which is that they'll say on background and privately they're appalled by Roy Moore, but they can't afford to have a Democrat sitting in the Senate because they want to get tax reform through. But by walking that line, it's a de facto endorsement of the candidate they say they're appalled by.
It is. It kind of has echoes of Charlottesville, if you think about it, when he said, well, there's some good people out there,
right,
when there were neo-Nazis marching, killing one person. And then we look at it today, he's like, well, you know, he said he didn't do, well, the president basically admitted, I'd rather have a child molester in the Senate than a Democrat, and has set the standard for our country. Bob Corker back in Charlottesville said he doesn't understand, paraphrasing, doesn't understand the character of this country. Well, once again, clearly Donald Trump doesn't get it. We don't want child molesters in the U.S. Senate.
And so, John, he says he denies it. He denies it. So he totally denies it. So, in other words, he's taken the word of Roy Moore versus the 9 women who've accused Roy Moore.
The White House isn't walking a line anymore. The president endorsed Roy Moore yesterday, and I think there's a reasonable chance he will go down and campaign for Roy Moore before we get to Election Day. I think, Casey came close to saying what I think is right, exactly right, which is to say he sees himself in Roy Moore.
What's the impact?
Well, the impact, I think, is now the president, especially if the president goes all in and ends up campaigning for Roy Moore, the exact disaster that Mitch McConnell foresees is now going to happen, where you're going to see 1,000 campaign ads calling the Republican Party the party of pedophiles as we go forward. This is the biggest gift-wrapped present for Democrats heading into 2018. You can imagine they were already salivating, regardless of what the outcome of this race is. It's 1 seat in the United States Senate. For Democrats heading into the midterms, a president who, despite the fact that the rest of the party has run away from Roy Moore, if the president runs towards Roy Moore and embraces him, as he seems to be increasingly doing, this is a huge gift for Democrats who will say the Republican Party, the head of the Republican Party, the President of the United States, now embraces credibly accused pedophile Roy Moore in the Alabama Senate race. We will see that played out over and over again for the next year in November of 2018.
And you're starting to hear that, Casey, obviously on TV, not only Democrats, but even some conservatives that want to see Roy Moore lose on Twitter are saying Republicans risk being called the party of pedophiles, as John Heilman says. Boy, that label sticks a little tighter if the President of the United States jumps in, doesn't it?
It does, and it's another very important, I think, data point for women voters in the midterm elections. I mean, look at what happened in Virginia. What drove Democrats to, you know, sweep these state legislative seats that they hadn't across the state in areas that were previously sending Republicans? I mean, a lot of the exit poll data suggests it was women, and you see that kind of as you start to talk to operatives behind the scenes. What are they looking for, and especially considering the broader national climate and the moment that we are living in. I mean, women are more, I think, engaged in politics and feel as though there is more at stake for them with their votes with every passing day. And I think this is something that, you know, Republicans who are looking at the midterm map, like Mitch McConnell and others, they know that.
Yeah. At the same time, I very carefully say that what the president said was not inaccurate.
Which is what?
He denies it.
Right.
And they accuse him. And I do think that is something that some voters will look at differently. Look, there are cases like this that seem like a slam dunk, even if they are 20, 30, 40 years old, because such a pattern is out there. But it's still accusations versus someone pushing back, and that does stay in a certain place.
With voters.
Especially in Alabama, and I don't say that in any critical way or stereotypical way, but it's a different culture that has had a set of generational shifts over time, Susan.
And it definitely sits there. I start looking towards 2018 when you look at the primaries in states like Nevada or Arizona, and you're going to see, there will be a fight in the Republican Party yet once again.
Right.
Is it going to be the party of child molesters, or is it going to be a party of responsible fiscal Republicans? And those primaries, and that's how it's going to really affect the president, I think, going forward, is where does he draw the line on, or who wants his line, I should say, in a primary, because he is saying, I don't believe these women.
Roy Moore could win this race. This is now no longer about Alabama. This is not a race about who wins that race. Roy Moore could win. The polling is going to be really sketchy all the way to Election Day for a million reasons. But in the end, with the president getting involved in this way, this is going to get nationalized. And the reality is, for a lot of, as Casey suggests, for a lot of suburban women in a lot of swing districts around the country who have watched the testimony of Roy Moore's accusers on television, have seen the woman talking to Savannah Guthrie on the Today Show the other day, seeing these women on camera. A lot of women around the country are, regardless of how it plays in Alabama, I agree with you.
That's what I mean.
Roy Moore might win this race in Alabama.
I think,
but there are a lot of suburban women around the country who believe these accusers because they sound extraordinarily credible on television.
No, of course they do. Again, I just very carefully say what I said, because I wouldn't want anyone to think that the accusers don't sound credible. They do sound credible to me. They are accusers.
They are.
And if this were a different state, I would be much more sure of the outcome. And I'm not saying anything bad about Alabama, by the way.
As we talk about the politics of this, think about the morality of it. Just put the race aside for a second. You have the President of the United States now saying clearly and out loud that he takes the side of Roy Moore. He takes the word of Roy Moore versus the word of the 9 accusers. He made that very clear yesterday. So if your moral code doesn't dictate that you come out strongly against someone who's been accused of these things, maybe a political strategic argument would prevail on the president, which is that you win this seat, this Senate seat for Roy Moore, it's a Pyrrhic victory, because you will be saddled, as you all have just said, as the party of a pedophile for the rest of Roy Moore's term. And by the way, the president will be saddled with that. To say, you stood up in this moment of truth, you stood up and took the side of an accused pedophile.
Before, though, and I've been saying that the polls, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the polls because people are going to lie. A lot of people, when you call up and say you're going to vote for Roy Moore. That said, the Alabama of 2017 is not the Alabama of 1977.
No.
It's not even the Alabama of 1997. I think it's more likely than not that actually Roy Moore will lose.
Right. Except, could I ask you a question? Who votes in Alabama in terms of age demographics more? The young people?
Well, in special elections, in any special elections, in any off-year elections, in the elections where the president is not on the ballot, the voters are older, they're wider, and they're more conservative. What we saw in Virginia, though, was we saw women and suburban voters come out at a pretty extraordinary clip, and washed away that natural built-in advantage. Eddie Gillespie didn't have a horrific time getting loyal Republicans out. Just more Democrats came out. I'll say it again. There are educated suburbs all around Birmingham, Mountain Brook, Vestavia, Homewood. You go parts of Montgomery, a lot of Mobile. You have a lot of educated women going out there, standing in lines, I think, a long time. I think, just like Virginia, that could make a difference even in the reddest of red states in America.
And then in that case, you get the worst of all worlds, where you get you lose the seat, and you've lost it in the process. In the process of losing it, you've ended up become the party of pedophiles, which is a double whammy on what the president's trying to pull off here.
And for Donald Trump, reports were for several weeks, Willie, after he lost the Luther Strange race.
Yeah.
That he was beyond himself. He could not believe it, and it just he was enraged, according to all the inside reports. Imagine if he gets involved in this race actively and goes down and campaigns, and he loses in the primary and he loses in the general election in a state that he told me during the campaign had his most faithful followers, and said, if I lose this race, I'm going to move to Alabama because they love me so much.
Right. I remember the summer of 2015, that event he had in Mobile, Alabama, the football stadium where the place was packed. That was an early signal to a lot of people. Something different's happening with the Trump campaign. He loves it down there. He's been rebuked once with Luther Strange. He was embarrassed. He deleted all those tweets in support of Luther Strange. And if he does it again, if he sticks his neck out, and not just sticks his neck out for a Republican, but for this Republican, that's beyond embarrassing.
All right.
Yeah, Casey,
jump in.
Just really quickly, one thing that Democrats have going for them here is that they actually have a really good candidate who really fits their state, and who is not. It's not a situation where it's a nationalized race where the DSCC went in there and didn't understand, or it's a progressive that doesn't line up. He is somebody who can actually go into churches with white voters. He can go into churches with African American voters. He fought this cold case with a KKK. Bombing. I mean, he is somebody who, the Democrats lucked out, quite frankly. They weren't paying any attention to it.
And the president did not tell the truth about that. I think he said he was soft on crime, maybe soft on the kinds of crimes that the president, whatever. The president seems to have a thing about race, an issue with it.
Yeah, incredible work.
So this candidate is strong. You're right, Casey. You never know. Coming up on Morning Joe, it seems to be becoming a common event. A federal judge blocking one of President Trump's orders, partially based on something that he tweeted. Those tweets come back to haunt you, don't they?
Time again.
We'll have that. And speaking of tweets, President Trump is somehow still fighting with the father of a college basketball player.
All right, so listen.
Where's John Kelly?
I've got.
It's not working.
Willie, Trump has to have stock in the shoe company.
I started to think the same thing.
No, I'm serious. He's got to be.
God.
And when those shoes explode, I promise he is going to tweet.
Do the shoes he may compete with Ivanka's?
He's going to take credit for the shoe sale. I promise he will.
No question about it.
But we'll never know. We won't see his tax returns.
He knows he's helping.
Exactly.
Just like he knows he's helping the New York Times, to the Washington Post, and shows like this, and CNN.
Which he doesn't watch.
CNN had its highest revenue ever last year. We've had our highest ratings ever this year. The whole
Failing Morning Joe.
I know.
Failing Morning Joe.
Psycho Joe.
No, but I'm saying he knows this. The New York Times exploding. The Washington Post doing extraordinarily well. And he has to know that he is selling a ton of sneakers right now.
That's exactly what I thought when I woke up and read those today. I thought, this is professional wrestling. This is a fake fight between two guys who know exactly what they're doing. They throw out the bait, the other one takes it. LeVar Ball goes on national TV in a long interview, pounds his chest at the end. He said, Big Baller Brand is going to have a great Thanksgiving. I hope the president does too. This is about selling sneakers. It's about selling his three sons and marketing them. Let's read these tweets. His early morning tweets this morning. The president called LeVar Ball a, quote, ungrateful fool and a poor man's version of Don King. And that was before he started attacking Hillary Clinton and the NFL.
We will be stronger and bigger and better as a nation than ever before. We're right on track.
So how does the press treat you? I'll bet you get treated better by the press than anybody in the world, right? Huh? I feel so good about myself, don't you? Are you ready, drumstick?
The tradition of Festivus begins with the airing of grievances. I got a lot of problems with you people. Now, you're going to hear about it.
Oh, man.
Oh my God.
I love Best of Us.
Jerry
So Mika has watched, She has such a blind spot.
Yes.
She's watched every Modern Family ever.
Yeah, ever.
She's watched
Ever.
every Office ever.
Absolutely.
And she knows she's one of these people, and I'm not for some reason. I think I was working during those years. Knows every single Seinfeld.
When I was in labor, I watched
episode
Seinfeld.
47.
Binged it.
It's interesting because you don't know anything else about pop culture.
Oh, not that there's anything wrong with that, Willie.
We had a great call with President Putin. We're talking about peace in Syria, very important. We're talking about North Korea. We had a call that lasted almost an hour and a half. We just put out a release on the call, but we're talking very strongly about bringing peace to Syria. We're talking very strongly about North Korea and Ukraine.
President Trump and Russian President Putin spoke on the phone yesterday for over an hour. A White House official tells NBC News the topics included Syria, in addition to Ukraine, Iran, North Korea, and Afghanistan. The call follows Putin's meeting with Syria's Assad in Sochi on Monday. Joining us now, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the book, A World in Disarray.
You know, Richard
Haas,
when I ate
for a hotspot roundup this morning.
When I ate every night at the Olive Garden, I would have the tour of Italy. What we're going to do here is sort of like that. Is where they basically
It's a
give you
hotspot
everything on the
roundup.
menu.
Yeah.
But instead of the tour of Italy,
It's a
we're
potpourri.
doing the tour of the world.
A tour de raison.
Yes, that's what I was going to say. Let's start though. I love German, and so let's start with that phone call.
Yes.
Yeah, let's start with the phone call. He talks for an hour to Vladimir Putin. Was the biggest takeaway Syria?
Yeah, and I think essentially the Russians and the Iranians have won.
The Russians own Syria now for the most part, don't they?
Even more the Iranians do.
Yeah.
They are the two most powerful external forces. Assad is here to stay for the foreseeable future and then some. And the question is, what happens to those lands that were liberated from ISIS? And does gradually groups backed by Iran and the Russians move in to regain control over large parts of the country?
I mean, Iran has large control over Iraq, does it not? I had somebody tell me this past weekend that you can have whatever sanctions you want, but the goods are going to be coming up through the southern region and right into Iran.
Southern Iraq looks like an extension of Iran, and there again, Iran is the most powerful external influence. Indeed, take a step back. Iran has become imperial Iran in some ways.
Right.
It now has influence from Lebanon, which is nothing new, through all the way, and now is obviously one
Lebanon,
of the proxies
Syria,
in the Yemen civil war.
Iraq, and obviously Iran.
And so it's interesting. This administration focused on the Iranian nuclear deal, but the real question we don't have an answer for it. What do you do about a country that is not a status quo country and wants to influence the region in fundamental ways? We have cast our lot with the Saudis and the UAE. The problem is we've cast our lot with the weaker side, and we don't want to at the same time get heavily involved. So we don't really have a strategy.
So what Sunni Arabs have been fearing for 10 years has happened.
Absolutely.
That is the rise of Iran.
Absolutely.
And that's why they actually fear Iran more than they fear Israel.
And there's a little bit of good there in the sense that some of the old barriers between the Saudis and others in Israel have broken down because they now have a common enemy. But this is in some ways the delayed strategic consequences of the 2003 Iraq War. Without a strong Iraq there to balance Iran, Iran was the principal strategic beneficiary of what the United States did in 2003.
Right.
We are seeing the fruits of that now.
So the exit of Mugabe in Zimbabwe is a lot like the last Lord of the Rings movie. It kept ending like 4 or 5 times, and you just never knew when it was finally going to, the screen was going to come down. Is he gone now for good?
I think he is gone after 37 years, thank God. But it's one thing to oust. It's something else to put in something better that lasts. And that's the real challenge. Can you create Is
this one dictator to another?
I hope not. And I think it's too soon to be that negative. But this ought to have been one of the real success stories. Rhodesia had it all. It had the minerals. It had the fertile land. It had a talented demography. But so many people have left. This really shows you what happens with terrible leadership. Mugabe destroyed his country. The question is whether it can gradually come back.
People don't remember back when he first went in there. There was so much hope.
Absolutely.
For that country. Steve would wonder even wrote about it. Peace has come to Zimbabwe. I mean, but it's just, again, it's been 37 years of horrid leadership.
And then what that shows is that transition away from minority rule didn't bring in something good. So the question now is whether this transition away from one-man rule will bring in something good. There's some positive signs. I was actually, it was wonderful to watch some of the reactions. Politicians across the aisle excited for the first time in their lives they could have real politics and not face threats. We'll see.
So North Korea, Richard, the North Korean government now placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list by the United States. New sanctions came down yesterday. There was an incident on the border. The United States says they violated North Korea, the armistice, when they shot a North Korean defector soldier on his way into South Korea. What's the impact from our side, from the United States side, of placing North Korea on the list of state sponsors of terrorism and ratcheting up the sanctions?
Almost none in terms of sanctions. There's so many sanctions. The incremental impact of these new sanctions is negligible. I think the real question, you can argue this one round or flat. It puts slightly more symbolic pressure on these guys. I don't know. It's also something conceivably we could lift.
By the way, Richard, while you're talking, excuse me, this is video of that incident along the border of a North Korean soldier defecting and being shot by North Koreans before he was rescued by South Korean soldiers.
Yeah, it's quite stunning what happened. This doesn't happen a lot. Have you ever been up to the DMZ? It's quite stunning that this happened. It may be further evidence that things in North Korea really are bad. And by the fact that we slapped on again the terrorism sanctions might give us a card to play, but it's not clear yet we're prepared to play cards. Are we prepared? You know, we've got all this pressure, all these threats. Are we prepared to put forward some kind of a diplomatic initiative that doesn't solve the nuclear and missile crisis in the first step, but at least stabilizes it? Are we willing to start diplomacy? So far, it's not obvious. I think we should.
Does that mean living with a North Korea that's working its way toward nuclear weapons?
It might mean at least stabilizing so the situation doesn't get worse, some kind of a freeze, no more testing. That would be a big deal. Again, it doesn't solve the problem. It stabilizes it. Then we could try to get no production and ultimately try to get rid of their nuclear weapons and missiles. But at the first stage, we have got to say what we would be prepared in exchange for a freeze on testing. That's called diplomacy, something that I would actually think we might want after 10 or 11 months.
Richard, a topic that you've followed closely, one that you've written about in yet another of his landmark books. It was not grilling, but the debt. And you actually talked about how security risks abroad are matched by security risks at home. And the U.S. debt, you believe, and most rational thinkers believe, is one of the great long-term debts for this country. And yet we're looking at strapping another $1.5 to $2.2 trillion on the national debt with this tax bill.
So what we're going to do is drive up the ratio, or the relationship between debt and GDP. What this will do is crowd out domestic spending because it's going to cost us more to pay down what we owe in the debt.
99 to 100% of GDP. What impact does that have? Can you explain to our viewers how does that impact this?
Yeah, it's the opposite of a virtuous circle. It's a vicious circle. What we have to do then is pay more money because the debt goes up.
Paying interest on the debt.
Paying interest on the debt. So either we have to raise taxes, which we don't want to do because that slows growth, which is the opposite of what the tax cut is meant to be, or if we spend more on the debt and we're not willing to trim entitlements, we don't want to cut defense, that means discretionary domestic spending, all the investment in our own future, that gets crowded out, that gets squeezed. So there's that problem. Plus foreigners say, hey, before we lend you more money, places like China, Japan are the two largest owners of American debt. They're going to get nervous about our willingness to repay it. That's going to force us to raise interest rates. That's also going to slow our economy. So everything that's being done in the name of accelerating economic growth, when it increases debt, it may force us to do things that actually slow economic growth, and we won't be able to invest on our own future. We simply won't have the money. That eats our seed corn. That's what makes us competitive, and in the long run, that's what gives us the basis for having a strong military.
So we're talking about crises abroad. What about here at home? Susan, you just got back from Puerto Rico, which you described in one word.
Horrific. The situation down there is unbelievable. I was up in the mountains in Camarillo on an aid mission with Somos Healthcare doctors in the Red Apple Group. And the first day we were able to feed 4,000 people. We were able to open a healthcare clinic, but those are temporary things. What was amazing was to go up into the mountains and go to the poverty-stricken homes, if you can call them that, with no water, no electricity, bathing in dark brown water. This is the quality of life these people have, and it is heartbreaking to see. And when we talk about not having money for infrastructure, we don't have money for crises at home. And that is what it is. It is at home in Puerto Rico. So the other thing that we're seeing there is there's also no commerce. There's no money exchanging. So you have the hotels are open, but they're used by FEMA workers. They're not spending money like tourists do. We, on our mission, instead of bringing supplies down, decided to put money into the pharmacies so people can go and spend their money in the pharmacies so we can circulate the money within the towns. Everything we did was on the ground.
Wow.
And we were able to do it, most of all, with just the community involvement. We didn't relate with the government.
Just went down there and tried to figure it out.
They went down in October, did some quick work, and then went back on this mission and was really able to have a tremendous effect. And we'll be doing it again.
Are you seeing the effects of people leaving? I mean, the numbers are staggering. You are hemorrhaging.
Oh, it's tremendous.
The most educated and the most well-off.
One of the scariest things is there are hospitals here in New York and around the country who are not performing certain procedures because the medical supplies they get are made in Puerto Rico. And as a result of what you were talking about, people leaving, even when the factories are getting online, the Pfizers and others, the workforce isn't there.
Right.
So it's not coming back. And unfortunately, I think we're going to hear more about this because people on the homeland are not necessarily getting procedures that they want to get, not necessarily the reverse.
So a federal judge yesterday temporarily blocked the entirety of Donald Trump's ban on transgender Americans serving in the military. Now, this comes after a federal judge in Washington, D.C. blocked parts of the ban a week ago. The president announced the ban seemingly out of the blue on Twitter back on July the 26th. And in his decision, Maryland Judge Marvin Garbus, who was appointed by Republican President George H.W. Bush, called Trump's announcement of the ban via Twitter, quote, shocking, adding, quote, a capricious, arbitrary, and unqualified tweet of new policy does not trump the methodical and systematic review by military stakeholders qualified to understand the ramifications of policy changes. Now, this is the latest judicial roadblock for the Trump administration, following challenges to his travel ban and sanctuary city executive orders.
Yeah.
And Mika, just like those tweets are hurting the president with a lot of his supporters, and they say that, and a lot of independents and a lot of persuadables, it actually time and time again is hurting him with federal judges who are blocking orders based on those tweets, which the White House has called official White House policy.
Well, the problem is that I believe those specific tweets, weren't they at a time when he needed a distraction desperately?
Manafort's house had just been broken
that's
into
right.
by the
So
FBI.
his house was scoured, and there was big story on the Russia front.
Yeah.
And so he did this sort of ridiculously ham-fisted, desperate tweet to distract. But the problem is that if you don't think about what you tweet, you end up, paying for it.
Well, he's a day trader.
Yeah.
So Casey Hunt, I'm wondering, just thinking about this in a slightly broader sense, as we head into the real heart of the tax reform debate or tax cut debate, how much do members on Capitol Hill at this moment sit there and think Donald Trump could at any moment undermine their negotiating positions and their legislative strategy by taking to Twitter in much the same way as he undermines his own moves in various ways by, again, taking to Twitter, as we just pointed out, with judges?
John, I would say that it's a constant, ever-present fear, but it's also a fear that they've gotten used to living with and trying to disregard. It sort of happened in the run-up to the vote in the House where he put out a tweet saying that the Obamacare individual mandate repeal should be included in the bill, and Paul Ryan and company kind of looked over their shoulder and said, "No, we're not gonna do that. We're gonna proceed on this path going forward." It's a little bit of a riskier path forward in the Senate. They have some work to do, but at the end of the day, the sense on Capitol Hill, I think on tax reform, who knows, right? I mean, you never know with this precedent. I mean, and I don't think members of Congress really know necessarily, but I do think they all feel very strongly that in this particular case, their own political futures are very much on the line. That pressure is very, very intense. You walk around the Hill, unlike with health care, where you felt like nobody really wanted to take a vote on that bill, everybody wants to get this done. And I think that at the end of the day, my sense is that will carry forward.
Richard Haas, that's the politics. There's the military reality of the transgender ban, too, which is when Donald Trump surprised everyone with that tweet in July. You had General Dunford and Generals Mattis both coming out and effectively saying, hold on a second, we're going to study this and make sure that this is a good idea. They know that these are people who have volunteered. They are the 1% in this country. These transgender troops have signed up and basically willing to put their lives on the line for the country.
Look, the American military has become the most successful institution in American society, first in dealing with racial issues, then gender issues, now issues like this. They know how to deal with this, and they don't have a lot of leeway given what they do for a living, given the threat they're under constantly. And they basically said, let us manage this. And so the president was dealing with it at the political level. They were dealing with it at the day-to-day granular level. Right. And they just wanted space to work it out. They know how to institute. They know how to make social change work in a context where there's no margin for error, and they've succeeded here.
All right. Well, Casey, before you go, John Conyers, go.
Well, where shall I start? Look, this is a lot of people think this is the tip of the iceberg on congressional sexual harassment and kind of what we're seeing spill into the open as part of the national conversation. I do think in this particular case, there's a story in the New York Times this morning that I would commend to you that includes some details about Conyers' overall kind of state of being. He is the Dean of the House. He's 88 years old. He's been there longer than anybody else. There's a lot of kind of frustration within the Democratic ranks that this guy really should kind of step aside and make some room for new leadership. The Times reports that he showed up to at least 2 separate meetings recently in his pajamas. And now he's, of course, facing all of these documents coming out. There's a new lawsuit that came out late last night that kind of outlines some of the sexual harassment faced by one of his staffers. The woman filed the lawsuit earlier this year. She decided not to go forward with it after a judge said that he wouldn't keep it sealed. So it ultimately didn't, go that far. But I do think, the environment in which we're living, the processes in Congress for people who are able to report sexual assault are archaic. Critics say they are stacked against the accuser. I mean, if you try to walk through the process, it takes forever just to explain the process. Imagine if you are a woman who's trying to file a complaint against a member of Congress. So I think everybody's kind of getting set on Capitol Hill for a real sea change around this. And
Casey, the Detroit Free Press is saying that Conyers must resign, but I saw some reports yesterday that even before this part of the story came out, that there were a lot. You talked about him showing up in pajamas 2 times. Talked about that John Conyers hasn't been mentally fit for the office for quite some time. That Democrats in Washington and in Michigan have feared that he would continue to embarrass himself. That he is too old and not fit mentally to be in the Congress.
I think there have been some questions about how much good he's able to do now on behalf of his constituents.
Although I would just say this pajama thing, Joe, I wouldn't be throwing rocks at houses. I've seen you on this show on many occasions in your pajama bottoms, and I've never questioned your sanity.
I walk into 30 Rock every morning in my pajamas, but that's a whole different story. It's at 3 a.m.
Right.
Yeah. All right, Casey Hunt, thank you very much. Actually, I'm sorry, Casey DC, guys.
Here it comes.
Here it is.
All right. Oh, yeah.
Laser Rock.
Thank you.
R.I.P. Malcolm Young.
Yes.
Thank you as well, Richard.
Thank you, Richard.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Appreciate it.
And what chapter are you going to in your book this weekend to
A World
cook
in
the
Disarray.
turkey?
We're smoking the turkey.
Oh, really?
That'll
Chapter
be
6.
Chapter 14 of A World in Disarray.